Okay, thank you everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, so we don't really need an introduction from Matt Welch, but if you haven't heard of him before, he is the editor-at-large of Reason Magazine. You can see him online on Reason TV. He's often, you can see him on cable news, such as the Kennedy Fox show. He's on MSNBC, CNN. He's all over the place. Last year, he was all over the country covering the Johnson Weld campaign and getting to meet libertarians all over the place, including I got to meet him in Sacramento. So for no... Let's bring Matt Welch up, everybody. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks, everyone. And sorry, not sorry for playing Debbie Boone on the guitar last night.
Round 2 late, light up my life.
I got to the key change, and it was at the end, you know, it was hard to find that chord, but I thought it was heroic otherwise. You're going to regret very soon here that I am speaking in front of you and not my 8-year-old daughter. So I'm like, as if any of you follow me more closely than you should, I'm not just, you know, a squishier libertarian than most of you, but I'm like the anti-evangelical one. Like I associate myself with Penn Jillette's notion that he said like 5-10 years ago. Like, I'm so libertarian, I don't even want to tell people how I think they should vote. That makes total sense to me. So I'm usually that guy, never belonged to a political party, although I vote for yours more often than anything else. And so I got into libertarianism largely through the door, which I'll talk about a little bit later, of Václav Havel and some Central European thinkers who weren't necessarily libertarians. They were actually sort of allergic to the concept of ideology itself as a distorting lens and a smothering thing on people's lives. So I have always been very careful to try to be fair and not indoctrinate my children into my strange beliefs. This is the kind of person I've always been. So, and I should add that even though I take Penn Jillette's dictum of not wanting to tell people how to vote, I am proud that I talked him out of voting for Bernie Sanders, which he was he was like, I don't know, man, he's honest. And I'm like, do you realize he wants a revolution on your face? And he wrote the blog post that Matt's right, I was wrong, which I thought was pretty very happy about that. But still, I didn't get through this through Atlas Shrugged or any philosophy or anything like that, and so I'm generally allergic to kind of philosophical beginnings of things, being a dullard from Long Beach, California. And so 2 years ago, we're going through tax season in my household, which is always a very nervous time, not necessarily for the same reasons that it's nervous time for everybody here. One reason is because my wife is French, and if any of you know the horrendous thing as known as the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, helpfully acronymed as FATCA, because obviously it's going to get the fat cats, man. What that means is that if you're not a fat cat and you have any money in increments larger than 10,000 bucks outside of the country, you have to submit yourself to an auto-proctology exam in front of the IRS, well, on penalty of jail time. I mean, it's terrible. It's actually, you know, there's at least 6 million Americans, I think now the estimate's up to 7.5 million, who live abroad. They can't get bank accounts because of this damn thing. Because the IRS, with this, has told foreign bank institutions, you have to make sure that your clients are paying us money, and if you don't, you have to send us 30% of their money that they have with you. And foreign financial institutions naturally do this, and they stop accepting American clients everywhere, so people can't get mortgages. They're ripping up American citizenship every quarter at rates never before seen, and which the State Department then helpfully publishes as on a name and shame list, because they're supposed to feel bad for doing this. So anyways, we're nervous about the FATCA in general, and then my wife is just one of these strange and lovely creatures who sees tax season as a reason to feel bad that she didn't earn as much as she wanted to the year before. So it's like a dark. So it's nervous around the house. Excuse me for persistent pneumonia here. Nervous around the house, and my 6-year-old rightfully is like, "Why are you guys so nervous about your taxes?" And I tried to help explain. And then she said, "But what are taxes, Daddy?" Like, okay. And I live in Brooklyn. Okay, so like you know how much money I paid to the New York City in income taxes this year?
Yes, I do.
Holy shit! I've never been that guy who like generally complains about taxes in my life. Just for whatever reason, it hasn't made me passionate. But my God, when you look at how much you're paying to New York City. So she asked me the question, a 6-year-old girl, don't want to indoctrinate her, want to play it cool, want her not to be a pariah in school more than she's going to be anyway. Well, honey, and my wife is French too, so, you know, they're a little bit socialist around the bridges. So taxes are things that the government, you know, there are things like bridges and roads. I started doing it. I started doing everything. I know! Wait a second. I told you that you would regret not inviting my 8-year-old daughter. So I gave her a kind of clenched-jawed thing of how they are used, regardless of whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. And they take that money from us out of the money that we earn. It sort of depends on how much and these kind of things. And she digested the information. Again, I was portraying it like a CNN anchor at this point to her. And she goes, so basically what you mean is that that taxes are like stealing.
Amen.
It wasn't even my fault. So the last time I was in the great state of Florida for a gathering of libertarian people, party people, was a year ago, and I met many of you there, and I apologize when I say, yeah, I remember you, because I met a lot of people there and was working very hard and might have had a glass or two of things, but not nearly as much as Nick Gillespie did. God. But so I had one of the greatest kind of journalistic faux pas of my career was literally the last time I was at a Libertarian Party gathering, is because it was a Sunday, and we're all waiting around for the Bill Weld round 2 voting, and you know, people are going nuts around the hall. It's very exciting and tense, and C-SPAN and all this stuff. But I had a flight to catch. Thank you so much. And Sarwark is like, oh, let's have. I don't know what to say, but let's have a bunch of speeches from the people who are running for chair for the next God knows how long. I'm like, oh Jesus, I gotta get going. And then this guy comes out, and this ginger-haired fella who I'd met, very nice earlier, and he comes out of the boombox and he says, "All right, let's put our hands together, let's loosen things up." And I think, oh Jesus Christ, I'm not going to watch this. And I walked out at that moment before, like 30 seconds before the man boobs striptease that changed American life. So the only part of this great world historical moment that I caught. And I hope that the people who I'm about to describe are in this room, because I'll never forget the looks on their faces. Remember that long hallway that you had to walk the gauntlet and to get out of the hotel? And generally speaking, Gillespie would be passed out on a couch in that hallway. You remember that? So I'm walking out, and you can feel there's some kind of disturbance in the force. There's something that happened. And there are 2 guys, and they're kind of dressed respectably, and maybe, I imagine them having earpieces. They were helping to organize there. And they were at the very end of the hall, so I'm walking the gauntlet here, and you see them, and I think maybe one was talking on the phone, and I got to watch like in slow motion as their faces start to twist in like incomprehension and rage, like, oh shit! And then I take off running. So it was a beautiful moment. But I want to kind of pivot from that a little bit. I was really heartened to see that you guys dedicated your event to Mark Allen Feldman, who I was very moved. That was my first, by the way, it was my first ever Libertarian Party gathering as a reporter of any sort. I think I had spoken once at a state convention in Ohio, but I hadn't covered this party. One of the reasons why I stopped being editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, which I was fortunate enough to edit from 2008 through last year, was because of that moment when it became clear that Donald Trump was going to win the primary. I think it was after an Indiana vote, election, when it became mathematically impossible for Ted Cruz to get it anymore. There was just an overnight, like, boom, it lit up Google searches on our site and Google searches, and we hear from our friends in the Libertarian Party too. Everybody was like, okay, what else is out there? All at once, and our readership, donor base, everybody was suddenly, like, overnight lit up by the idea of Johnson, and then the idea of Weld came on a little bit afterwards, and obviously provoked mixed responses, but some people were excited about that too. And so we hastened that. I had been intending to step aside and let smarter and younger legs take over the editing for a while, but I was thrust into it, and it was sort of my first time in it, and it was a fascinating convention to cover for the Weld stuff and for the great man-boob stripper debate that ensued. And we actually had a Cato Unbound whole like exchange on this that I participated in last year about like agonizing over the meaning of this, and I find it fascinating. And in the debate, of course, as I typically do, because I'm that guy, I didn't come out and make the grand conclusion about what we should do with young James Weeks and things like that. But I'm more interested in this recurrent thing that happens, you may have heard of, at libertarian institutions. And it's not just this party, it's not just this state version of it, it's the Free State Project, it's Students for Liberty, it's every libertarian institution at some point, I think, goes through this kind of moment where there's a clash between, popularity is rising, and then, but like, does that mean everyone's looking at us and are we weird? Should we be, how should we deal with our weirdness and our weird people? And it's not just a libertarian thing, it's happened in every political movement that lived on the margins forever and then suddenly one day did not. The people who were in favor of gay marriage in 1975 weren't a lot of people there, and suddenly that reached some kind of tipping point. It went, kind of gay rights in general went from being the freaks and I say that lovingly, as I hope you understand, at Castro Street Parade in 1975 to now Andrew Sullivan is writing like these things, and I'm confused now. What do I do about that? So it's this recurrent thing, and so I wanted to share not as a necessarily super direct metaphor, but maybe some insights about similar things that I observed when I was living in Prague in the 1990s. We had these constant battles over what is the real world, what is professionalism, how is it keeping it real, how do these things collide in this kind of a recurrent world. So this is going to require a little bit of self-indulgent storytelling. I lived in Central Europe in all of the 1990s, in my 20s. Super hippie, earrings, started a newspaper there. It was the first English language post-communist independent newspaper in the former East Bloc, which is a really long thing to fit on a business card. But it was obviously a great and world-defining experience, and we were constantly hit with this. Because this will come up, I will explain how and why that came to be. I had the good fortune that hopefully at least a few of you have had in this room of being born in 1968, which obviously is a year of quashed revolutions and assassinations and gruesome body counts in the Vietnam War. There's actually more people killed, U.S. Troops killed in the Vietnam War in 1968 than we've had in all of our subsequent wars combined on the U.S. side. So gruesome, horrible year, but the best part about being born in 1968, besides the fact that every single book is about 1968 and you feel special, is that you become 21 in 1989. In 1989, everyone wants to think that 1968 was the revolutionary year. 1989, I think, arguably is the most profound year for liberty and human flourishing that we've had, at least since the end of World War II, and arguably in history. It's an amazing moment when an empire that was evil collapsed, and a lot of people who were not free suddenly began to be able to flirt with freedom. So I had been working at a college newspaper that was particularly good. I was not a particularly good student. I'd been kicked out a long while before, and my contract, I was making decent money on the university side doing typesetting, which is an ancient thing that some of you are aware of. So I was able to save money for a little bit. I knew that my contract was up in June of 1990. I had set aside November and December of 1989, when there was a publishing break, to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And the prospects were kind of grim. I was a 21-year-old college dropout, and there was a recession starting, and it was particularly biting on newspapers, which is the only thing I knew how to do. So I was sitting on my dad's couch, and like, oh, what should I do? I can, maybe transfer to Cal State Hayward, or I don't know, work pay stub at an alt weekly somewhere. It wasn't pretty. And CNN was on. I was watching TV. I'm like, oh, there's that revolution there done by people exactly my age who also like to listen to the Velvet Underground, and they didn't kill anybody, and they just put the playwright in the castle as the president. I think maybe I'll go there. So it was a fortunate thing. There's a lot of people my age around that time who all did the same thing. They just set out for these new territories. For some of you younger folks, it's hard to overstress how much that was not something that anyone expected in 1988. It just was, there was a European map, and half of it was black, undifferentiated. No one went there. You didn't know, you didn't know there was a separate thing called Slovakia and the Czech Republic. You knew nothing about any of it, and then suddenly we had a chance to go there. So a lot of us lit out, and a bunch of people from my college newspaper, kind of by accident, after I had established a kind of beachhead, living in an apartment for $20 a month with a couple of Czech freakers my age who had been part of the revolution. And so we were having fun. Friends kept coming through. It was a coincidence of timing. Oh, I can't believe that we're all here at the same time. 1,000 beers were drank at the secret police bar too, which is pretty great. And collect phone calls were made to parents. Totally bullshit management structures were made up. Like, okay, we'll sell shares for $400. I don't know why, but that's a good round number. And so we had pledges of people who wanted to invest, $2,000 or $3,000, and that was enough, damn it, to get things going. And ironically, because we were again a post-communist newspaper, so we were primarily interested in issues of transition. But so by definition, you're an anti-communist newspaper because everything around you, you see people who precede every single sentence by 40 years of communism had totally poisoned our minds, and we have to. The things that you learn are just were horrific. So. Ironically, there, one of the co-founders of the paper who I'd gone to school with, his name's Chris Scheer, great guy. His dad's Robert Scheer, Bob Scheer. He's an old New Left journalist who I had and still have a great fondness for. He's become a big Ron Paul and the Fed guy, by the way. He claims that I have talked him into libertarianism, which isn't true, but I will take the credit for it. But he was this old New Lefty guy. He's totally bought in with the whole kind of Brentwood mafia. So he went to them and asked for donations at this newspaper, hippie, scruffy, anti-communist newspaper. So we got people like Oliver Stone, Barbara Streisand, Norman Lear, and God knows who else investing in a newspaper that I ran, which I think is really funny in retrospect. So we did things that young, naive people do. And again, I say that with affection, and this is, again, something that happens to all young, naive institutions and the people who work for them, which is we are going to do everything different than has ever been done in this field that we are doing. You see this also with songwriters, right? Like, I am not going to repeat what anyone does, but at the same time, you're naive and young, so every new thing, which is actually super old. Like I remember when I first discovered D minor as a chord, like, my God, what is this thing? I am going to write a song around this thing. So you had this great flowing thing. So we would sit around, and this was a great ethic. So we were not going to look or sound or talk like any newspaper. Starting with the title, okay? It's going to be called the Prague Times. It's not going to be called the Prague, Journal, news journal. It's going to be called something. I just wish we could figure out something. And of course, because we were probably stoned on hash or something. Like someone said, what do we call it, prognosis? And we couldn't think of a better name. That was the stupid name that we were saddled with, but because we like had this revolutionary ethic of we're going to do this this way. So you start to see these kind of trade-offs that constantly happen between this great inspiration that we said we were never going to write an article about like economic reform without having a human being, preferably a picture of a human being, just to constantly ground it in the realities of how people were living their lives. Part of this was also a gesture of humility. Like, what the hell do we know about this country? We can't speak the language. We're all learning. But we're not going to come in there and tell people this is how you need to do things with your life. And so we wanted to tell these stories. And because of all this, it ended up becoming a pretty interesting and pretty unique looking paper that I think has sort of stands the test of time in terms of artistic quality. But we were totally 1,000% ridiculous. So we made the disastrous decision to operate based on communal understanding, consensus. It's like 6 of us, like we all had to agree on things. Because we were young, dirty hippies, we would literally have like 4-hour impassioned debates, people crying on whether we were losing and ruining the soul of what this institution is if we stopped allowing random backpackers to crash on the floor of the office whenever they wanted to, who were showing up. So this was haunting everything. And part of this too was that, and I only really became to appreciate this later, is that it's hard to describe how anarchic and up for grabs everything was, particularly there. I got there in 1990 in August, so this is 9 months after the Velvet Revolution. The paper first started in March of 1991. One system had collapsed, but the new one hadn't been built yet. And so no one knew what it looked like. And everybody from the presidents on down were flirting with ideas that were the naive idea that had probably been tested 1,000 times before, but it was occurring to them for the first time. So in the case of Václav Havel and a lot of the people around him, they were talking about non-political politics. We're going to create a politics that doesn't need political parties, man. And it sounds great. You're attracted to this, especially when you're 22, and then you think about it for a second, like, that can't possibly work. There's no way that works. And in fact, he and the people around him, and they tried versions of that in the other Central European countries too, and all the people who adopted that kind of idea, and also its corollary of like a government of experts, which is a chillingly terrifying idea, they all got slaughtered by the ones who went quickly into, no, we're going to be boring political party as soon as possible, like Václav Klaus, who was Havel's kind of sworn enemy. Added to this, so you have like people like me who were going in. You could get a job there if you spoke English by being an English teacher. That was just it. You had no qualifications required. But it wasn't just that. You could get a job as an American advisor on the fact that you were an American and you were advising. I knew American advisors to the mayor. I do American advisors to everywhere, and so everyone's walking around, and they would always use this phrase, like, in the real world, I wouldn't be able to do this. And this is true, in a sense, and it's also kind of false. Ultimately, is what I came to conclude. Yes, the real world didn't allow for instance, the Havel and the rest of them early on said, let's just disband the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and like no one will ever have a defensive alliance again. 2 or 3 years later, those same people said, oh, holy shit, we can't do that. We need a defensive alliance. Can we join the club? Can you expand it for us? So, Havel disbanded all weapons factories in this country, which led to, they were one of the biggest weapons producers in the world. So the real world kind of intervened in that. There was higher unemployment, and he was hit with a lot of criticism because of that. But at the same time, what I came to think of, and I should point out, remember the whole like, we're not going to call ourselves the Prague Post or whatever? Well, our business staff at the time were always hit when they're trying to sell ads with, why is this paper so kind of weird and hippie-like and stuff? Why aren't they more professional and normal? They lit off and they started a competing paper called the Prague Post, which ended up beating us. I mean, we went bankrupt after 5 years. They were boring and normal. And the great thing is, we died after 5 years. No one remembers them. I mean, they were totally successful, but there aren't any great myths told of this wonderful paper back when. Whereas we kind of cut a beautiful figure. I had written so you're 22, so you're insufferable, writing about these kind of things and how I'm supposed to act professional and all these kind of concepts. So I wrote a column about that for the paper back then. And the first angry letter to the editor that we received there from the expatriate community, pointing it at me, saying "Hooray for the Pope of Prague!" Right, very sneering and condescending, came from a trust fund jerkbag who was spending his days in the local casino, just gambling, not doing anything, and I almost never saw him around. That guy's name was Jonah Goldberg. So Jonah from National Review has since, he and I have since become friends and bonded over this, but it's the kind of agonizing that you do there. But my ultimate takeaway from all of that is that fuck the real world. Sorry for kids, you're not supposed to hear these languages. We should be trying whenever we can to create a world so beautiful that we get to do these crazy things that we wouldn't otherwise do. And that time, there won't be a person that you will meet who lived in that area in that time of their lives who won't point to that period as about the most special time. You had a city that was under the thumb artificially of totalitarianism, where everything was choked off. How many of you have been to Prague here? It's just a marvelous place. It's a place of exchange and alchemy and art and weirdness and dark alleys and things like that. Havana, Cuba is much like that. If you, for those of you who've been there, it's not as dark and twisted, but I mean the same kind of artistic sense. And it's also been choked off from its natural place at a crossroads of humanity. Prague had been choked off, and we got to participate in not just our own discovery of it, but its own rediscovery of itself, and all these revolutionary kids flooding in who wanted to re-engage in exchange with the rest of the world. That should be the real world. When it's not the real world, I mean, it shouldn't be the real world that you were so choked off to begin with. But it's worth holding on to that. Talking a little bit about of Havel himself, and this sort of runs it more towards a reaction of where we're living in Trump's world. How many of you have seen things on Twitter where there's someone's like, experts on anti-authoritarianism tell us to keep lists of all things that change, so that when we can see every week how the authoritarian Trump is moving us into a new direction. I haven't seen such an interest in Solzhenitsyn, in Orwell's 1984, in Brave New World, and also in Václav Havel. People are going back to the writings and the teachings of the greatest anti-authoritarians and totalitarians of the 20th century. And part of me, a strong part of me, is heartened by that, because that stuff has as much influence on me as anything else. There's also a couple of caveats to that that I want to get into in a little bit. But first I want to talk a little bit about Havel in particular, and some of his notions that are so resonant forever, but certainly of the time, and that they're interesting. He had this idea called living in truth, and this, you see versions of this again all the time on Twitter, like, in an empire of lies, truth is the biggest threat, and these kind of things. So he wrote this in real time in 1975, when by writing this and talking about this, it would send you to jail, and sent him to jail. And he had these revolutionary insights, and I'm going to call up one of what he wrote in 1978, especially in the power of the powerlessness, which is the most remarkable essay, I think, written under communism. In it, he spells out, and again, there's no chance any of this stuff is going to happen. You look, the future is an uninterrupted, bleak outlook. You can't win. So he's writing, knowing A, that by writing this essay, I'm going to prison, which in fact happened, and B, that no one believes what he believes. And yet, he says, if the main pillar of the system is living a lie, and his great example is, every day on May Day, everybody has to go outside and put the Workers of the World Unite sign on the greengrocer shop window, and everyone pretends all this stuff, and he sort of dismantles piece by piece by piece all the lies that are out there, and including the fact that the regime knows everyone who's doing that is lying. But that's the point. They want your nose is being pushed into the dog poop here. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living the truth. This is why it must be suppressed more severely than everything else. It's a very apt analysis of it, but then he talks about how by starting to not put the workers of the world unite, sign up, by insisting, by calling things by its proper names, which is a formulation that he and his fellow members of Charter 77, which is the remarkable, groundbreaking organization that started in 1977, brilliantly by telling the government to live up to its own constitution. And it's one of those things like the French Resistance. Everyone said that they're members of Charter 77, got like 100 signatures in 1977, and everyone went to jail. But anyway, so he writes further, if people start the process of just insisting on saying things that are true, taking the extra hard work, because it is hard work to not just bullshit your way through life and not make a cheap political point at the expense of actual knowledge. But if everyone insisted on that, and especially in a totalitarian setting, then, quote, the entire pyramid of totalitarian power, deprived of the element that binds it together, would collapse in upon itself, as it were, in a kind of material implosion. That's what happened. That's amazing what happened. So it's very intoxicating and energizing to read those words and think about their application in our day-to-day life here in Trump's America. And it's also a little bit self-delusional. And I want to get into the self-delusion of that. First of all, none of us lives in a totalitarian country, and we never will. Let's be clear about that. There's a going back to the trade-offs that we made in well, actually, I'll shelf this. This was I was going to go into a John Carpenter, The Thing tangent, and I think we're all glad that I'm deciding not to do that. But we don't live in that kind of sense of totalitarianism. We should guard against it, and thinking consciously about acting in a truthful manner is very important, yes. But there's a reason why people like literalists, journalists, many of them, whom consider themselves to be, like to wrap themselves in it, because it's virtue. I'm in the virtue cloak of being against this authoritarian nightmare person. I, and only I, really have access to this truth. Well, how many people have seen a fact check exercise in a newspaper that was just as full of BS as the original?
They did it about us, by the way.
I'm not surprised at all. There is, similarly, how many people saw the great Selena Zito notion during the campaign, which I think is right, which is that Trump's critics in the media take him literally, not seriously. Trump's supporters take him seriously, but not literally. Very true. A lot of people who are in the literal words business, and I am one of them, I am indicting myself here, spent all last campaign thinking and dealing and reacting as if we live in a hyper-literal world, as if there aren't these emotional connections on which people actually consume politics more often than not, as we learn. And so they can wrap themselves into little kind of literal or fake literal truth areas without themselves acknowledging their own kind of distortion that goes in it, right? This is one reason I'm always so allergic to things like no labels and these kind of centrist organizations. Like, we're just going to do pragmatic problem solving here. We don't believe in ideology. It's like, you know what, as soon as you say we must do something, that is as ideological as anything you'll see in a party full of libertarians. And that was the great blind spot of Havel himself, also George Orwell, who's a great anti-authoritarian thinker and writer. He got a lot of things wrong. Havel was in favor of the Iraq War, and I can see how he got there. I have some empathy with that, knowing the way his system of thought. But he also got to a place late in his life, sadly, where he started talking about the evils of market fundamentalism, which is this kind of BS term that George Soros helped popularize in the late 90s and early aughts. He became blind in his own hatred towards Václav Klaus, who's totally hateable, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you care about such things, but that he didn't see the own distorting lens of his own ideology, which is a problem. So people they're failing to understand and connect that people's relationships are emotional, and they hive it off and think that they are the sole captains of the truth. Well, I went to Havel's funeral in 2011, and so I remember you know, from my conception, the thing that I found so thrilling about him, besides just the kind of amazing sweep of his life, was this whole notion of living in truth. And the best collection of his writings is called Living in Truth, and there's another one that I recommend called Open Letters. That is a collection of his essays, particularly during communism. Really great stuff. But, so I walked around and I was looking at all of the posters and everything around town, and I was expecting to see basically the slogan of Living in Truth or something like that. But it wasn't that. It was something else. And it took me years after this to understand the importance of it. It was a little picture of him walking on the beach with his little signature heart, which he put on a signature, and it was truth and love must prevail over lies and hatred. Right? So it wasn't just living in truth. It wasn't just being literalist and making sure that every comma was in the right place. There was also a sense of, and I went back and started reading more of his thoughts on this, there's also a sense of you can use truth as a weapon to do bad things. And you probably will if you have a dark heart. You can bend and twist things to make things seem a certain way. It doesn't matter if you're using this to bad ends, and in its own way you're creating your own distortions. It's an important lesson. And the other important lesson in this, and hopefully I'll stop soon afterwards, is that, and this gets back to these kind of fundamental conflicts and even sense of tolerance of people's differences, is that the phrase itself, living within the truth, is actually how he used it more often than not. It didn't originate from Havel. It originated from an absolutely insane, almost pygmy-esque, alcoholic, impish poet rock nightmare named Ivan Martin Yerush, who I had the fortune to know a little bit, who everyone knows as Magor. He was the inspiration, like the artistic inspiration behind the rock band, the Plastic People of the Universe. He talked about living in truth. The way that he meant it was that I get to do what I want to according to my own lights, and the rest of you can go fuck yourselves. It's a little bit different than hair splitting on like a political statement. That's not a fact check. This has had profound influence on Havel. In fact, it was the thing that propelled him into political action back in the day. Basic can story, there's this band, bunch of dirty long hairs. Prague had an opening between 1964 or so and 1968 known as the Prague Spring. That was the Prague Spring, not the Soviet tanks coming in. That was more the Prague Winter afterwards. And so Prague reasserted its natural cultural role during this brief window. I mean, Milos Forman's movies started coming out then, which are incredible, the early Czech ones, and I encourage you to go see like Black Peter and Fireman's Ball. Wonderful stuff. All this great art. Havel participated in this stuff as a playwright. This band, Scruffy Longhairs, got their hands on the Velvet Underground and Nico record, which came out in 1968 in America. So it's right before, I mean, Soviets invaded in end of August of 68. So they managed to get this thing just before. Really great, wonderful, bleak Lou Reed songs about masochism and heroin and God knows what else, but also kind of lilting and beautiful and haunting. All this, they got a hold of it. These guys who'd just been playing, blues songs and stuff, and so they decided that their twin pillars of inspiration were going to be the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa. God help them. They got their name, Plastic People from the Universe, from that. So they started this band. We're playing around, we're becoming semi-well-known. And then after the Soviet invasion, they started this period of normalization. Speaking of another term that's being used horribly these days, but real normalization was as bad as a thing has been. They just completely stifled it. If you were in a rock band in Prague in 1971, you had to have your name approved by the authorities, your set list approved by authorities. Every single person was part of the bureaucracy, so you wouldn't get approved. None of this would. And the only places that they could find little zones of freedom is that they would play weddings. So a lot of people were getting married in the countryside, and they would go hear the Plastic People of the Universe, who would play just a whole bunch of Velvet Underground covers, and then started to do their own material, a lot of which the lyrics were written by this crazy dude, Magor, who again, I mean, if you ever saw him, he was probably just recently lit himself on fire and was spitting drunk and like vomiting and urinating. He's a total wild man of the universe. They were arrested in 1975 or 76 on charges of hooliganism, disturbing the peace. And that was the thing that set the light bulb off in Havel's head. He said, if these people who are living authentically according to their own code cannot just do what they want to do, which is be dirty, gross rock stars, then there is something fundamentally wrong. And he was also inspired by it just on the music of it. He saw it as an act of punk rock that he needed to participate in at the time. And so what he did is, even though every last thing here is going to be illegal, he decided to cover the trial for them. So he would walk in every day and like, what are you doing? You're not approved here. He's like, yep, here we go. And he would cover the trial, and he would write it up for Radio Free Europe, which was populated by emigres from Central Europe. And he wrote this incredible essay at the time about it that has this really, liberatory kind of feel to it, where at the end of it, I think he says, observing this all happen in the way that they did, and seeing the difference between society that's accepting this and the authority that's making it happen, and then these rock guys here realized that I no longer wish to live in this world of, and then hyphen, excuse me, Mr. Censor, or whatever the guy's name, but the guy who's ahead of censoring everything this, you might want to cover your ears here, a world of cunning shits. So it was just like, boop! And Charter 77 started up as a defense organization to defend this dirty, filthy rock band from being arrested on charges of hooliganism and having long hair and a bunch of other kinds of things. So his conception was, we need to defend, first and foremost, people's ability to live authentically the way that they want to. So there's something baked into that, I think, a sense of tolerance and solidarity for that kind of difference here. And as we all go through our own growing pains and whatever else that we do in our lives, and conflicts that we might have with people, knowing that and celebrating that and realizing that a life authentically lived and authentically kind of tolerated is not just a threat to a regime. Yeah, that's interesting, that's good, but it's also just valuable on its own. It's also worth creating the space to allow that to happen, and then defending the space around it. So it's another concept of living in truth that I think has broader applications than just idiot fact checkers at ProPublica or whatever. And with that, I think I'll wrap up and take questions, because I want to hear from all of you about all your things.
I have one, Matt.
Yes.
Can you expound, as you promised you would, about Václav Havel and Václav Klaus's animosity of some kind, or
Yeah.
And as a sub-theme to that, if you happen to know, why Václav Havel refuses to participate with or do anything with Severo?
Don't know anything about the latter of it, or what it's referring to, so I'll go with the former.
Severo.
What's that?
You don't know Severo?
No, I have blank spots the size of Kansas under numbers. I only got to page 73 of Atlas Shrugged. There was a Facebook group called Get Matt Welch to Read Atlas Shrugged. It was people were outraged that I hadn't finished it, and they mailed me a used copy that they obviously bought for like $1.03. So I went through it. Anyway, so Havel and Klaus. Klaus was the first finance minister of Czechoslovakia before the country split up, and he was a very late comer into the world of dissidents. Kind of wasn't. I mean, he burnished his dissident credentials afterwards, and it was clearly one of his chips on his shoulder about Havel is that Havel got all the love and all the respect for being Johnny Dissident, and Klaus wasn't given the respect of being someone who was championing, as he did, Schumpeter and Hayek and other people in the late 80s as he was working for an econometrics institute there, called the Prognostic Institute. And so that and also Klaus had the correct, in my view, opinion that we need to get into political parties, professional political parties, as soon as possible, and all this airy-fairy, non-political politics is going to fizzle out and be exposed as dumb. I think he was correct about that. So Klaus also, and this is important, is a total dick. He's just a dick. I've met a lot of politicians over the years. He's the dickiest. It's not close. I got into some trouble that the day that he was speaking in front of the Competitive Enterprise Institute like 5, 6, 7 years ago, I wrote, I don't think I called him a dick, I think I called him an asshole. I'm keeping it, legit here, at reason. And so people like, it's our friends, and that's kind of like undercutting him. But it's not just that he is abrasive personally. It's that we covered him in real time there. And we saw what people who will give a guy 1,000 standing ovations if he just drops Thatcher's name once in a speech. I saw him work the rubber chicken circuit of gullible libertarians and free market conservatives in this country so many times. Dudes, I was there. He was less free market in 1992 than the Hungarian Socialist Party, and it's not close. It never was close. He wouldn't liberalize rents. He wouldn't liberalize utilities. Hungarians did all that. He wouldn't allow people to buy a company, foreigners to buy a light bulb factory like they did in Hungary in 1987. GE bought Tungsram. He wouldn't allow that kind of stuff to happen. He was, anytime there was, he wouldn't allow there to be the development of a nonprofit sector there, because he saw that as a place that would have direct challenge and authority to the state. He's a statist. He always was, and a charlatan too. And I think belatedly, a lot of people in free market Washington have come to realize, some of these things. So they had a feud, and I mean, I'm overselling a little bit his importance, or underselling his importance. He was a very important person. It's better to talk about Hayek and Schumpeter and Thatcher than not talking about it. It would be better to actually act on some of those things. And he didn't do nearly as much, and he had turned a blind eye towards corruption. He didn't care about dealing with the past and people's corruption with the regime, their ties to the SDB, and he fought with Havel on all of these. I commend, if those are interested in this, and I know it's boring and most of you aren't, there's a speech that Havel gave in 1997. And he'd been, he was super kind of drifting and distant intellectual. The president in that country doesn't really have a lot of power. And so he was sort of a moral scold than anything else. And he was talking about the Gaia hypothesis. He was starting to float off and talk about some weird stuff. But he came back after there was a government crisis in 1997 over corruption. And he gave one of the most blistering libertarian speeches you will ever hear in your life, talking about how we didn't do reform enough. We didn't privatize enough. We didn't purge ourselves of people who have connections to the secret police enough. We didn't do this and this and this, and it's all an indictment of Klaus. And so people who still maintain, like, Havel was a socialist and Klaus was the real deal, go read that speech and come back to me.
Thanks.
What do you think about anarchy within the Libertarian Party? People like to call themselves anarchists.
I like when people like to call themselves anarchists. Again, I'm not the guy to tell people about their business. It appears to me, just by eyeballing things, that there is one of the most kind of robust and growing sub-sectors of libertarianism is sort of the ANCAP movement writ large, and it's also a source of great creativity, I think, and of interest. And I know it causes headaches that I don't possibly want to even know about between people who might disagree with them about various things. But yeah, it's part of the deal, right? Like, you're in a political party, you got to hash your stuff out. My anarchist friends keep trying to tell me that eventually I'm going to become one. If I live in New York long enough, I think it's going to kind of get me there. But no, that's not who I am. But I do appreciate the energy and creativity of it a lot.
The short story we got about, this is back when the country broke up, was that Havel woke up one morning in the Slovakia and said, we want to be a separate country, and he said, okay, fine, goodbye. Is that the real story? Was there much resistance about them splitting up?
No, I mean, he resigned as president of Czechoslovakia and thought he was done with political life over this. He was heartbroken, absolutely heartbroken. And his class of people, who I always refer to as the failed Federalists, and again with affection, because I felt like I was one of them at the time, and I think I was wrong at the time. Slovakia, so the country was sort of artificially put together after World War I, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They had ties. The languages are 95% similar, but they're not the same. Slovakia is more kind of Catholic and pointing in this direction, Czechs are atheists basically and pointing in this direction, the Slovaks drink wine, Czechs drink beer. There was some differences, not a ton, but Slovakia never really had a sense of national fulfillment, with a brief period of World War II being an exception, and for many reasons that's very problematic. They had a clerico-fascist named Joseph Tiso, collaborated with Hitler. There's some problems there. So there rose up the thing called the Movement for Democratic Slovakia. And if you think I can bore you about Havel and Klaus, I can bore you for hours about the similarities between Vladimir Mečiar and the Movement for a Democratic Slovakia and Donald Trump and Trump's new Republican Party. I mean, they were going to make Slovakia great again. Do you remember the speech during the campaign? I want to say it was like August or September. It was this, obviously Steve Bannon wrote it, or Steve Bannon and Steve Miller wrote it, and it was this very kind of dark, these centers of influence in foreign countries, these transnationalists who want to erase all borders, they're sitting in their faraway places manipulating currency. I mean, that was, the only thing different between that and the Vladimir Mečiar speech from 1992 is that he wasn't being specific that the foreign capitals were Budapest, Prague, and Tel Aviv. Which was the bugaboos there. So it was very, very similar. This was an expression of longing for Slovakia to have its own kind of autonomy, because it was always the lesser half, way more kind of agrarian. They would the Soviets would dump the worst aluminum factories for no reason in the middle of their beautiful countryside. And they were always going to be treated like a messy, dumber brother by the Czechs. And so they backed this guy Mečiar, who, like Trump, was really great at doing politics. He would go to that city that no Slovak, Bratislavan intellectual would ever touch, let alone someone from Prague, and he would talk to them about what they cared about, and he would, I'm one of you, I'm speaking for you. And he just stomped in elections in 1992, as did Klaus. Klaus didn't run on separating the country. In fact, Mečiar didn't either. He was going to make Slovakia great again. I've never unhear the Viva Slovakia theme song there. But once those two guys ran as in the head of, it became clear that there's no way that they could coexist in the federation as it stood there. And so even though I think 8 of the 9 political parties that were made parliament in that were explicitly, they said they were anti-splitting up, it was clear that they couldn't help it but split up. And Mečiar had been caged. I think he wanted them to split up. And so they started going down this path amid an international cry of like, my God, this is going to be Yugoslavia all over again. And my mom was like, yeah, you got to be safe. You got to find a safe house. I'm like, what? It was the Velvet Divorce ultimately. I was there. The worst thing that happened when those countries split up was probably me on Námestí, or the square of the National Slovak Uprising, as the clock rang midnight. A friend of mine, Ken Lane, who used to run a site called Wonket, a very funny, weird person, decided that was the time to put on a big Malcolm X cap, because that was the movie that was popular then, and wave a gigantic Slovak flag from the middle of the square on top of a banister, yelling "Slovensko, Slovensko!" And very soon afterwards, we got assaulted by skinheads, and it was some mistakes were made, but it was like it was a slow motion thing that nobody really wanted, and people were upset that happened, and predicted all kinds of doom and chaos that really did not happen. And then I think within a year or two, almost everybody, including me, and I spent 2 different New Years in the village that was split up by those 2 countries, right? So like I know these people, I know the failed Federalists, but almost everyone's like, yeah, it should have happened. It's actually national self-determination. There's something to it.
Yeah, if memory serves me correctly, I believe Havel wanted Frank Zappa to be the ambassador to the United States from that country.
I believe it's to the United Nations. Zappa's last concert, he was ravaged with cancer. His last concert was in the summer of 1991, at a special concert that also featured Paul Simon, among others, to celebrate the last of the Soviet troops leaving Czechoslovakia soil, which is the first country that they pushed about. As soon as the revolution was over, Havel was like, okay, great. When are you guys leaving? We gotta get you out of here. Yeah, it's a weird time that will eventually be airbrushed by history because no one will be able to wrap their heads around, like super beloved American musicians hanging out with presidents of countries celebrating the expulsion of the Red Army. But it was fun to witness.
Sir.
Do you think we are still free here? I'm only 3 years younger, younger than you, and I've been awake for a long, long time. And just like you're saying, the taxes are out of control, the government's out of control, the police are out of control. I'm a wannabe vlogger. I got a big YouTube channel too, 55 million views. And even today, I just did an article.
Sounds like you're free, man.
Thank you. I redid an article on just even at the elementary schools, the police are there just freaking indoctrinating these little kids into thinking, hey, we're good and we're nice. And that's insane. We have the most people in jail and prison than the whole rest of the world, and we're supposed to be free. I do not feel free. Do you think we are still free, and can we take it back, or it's too late?
Here's where I agree with you, because I think on the broad question, I'm a deluded Californian optimist who's, do you guys follow the Human Progress Twitter feed? It just every day sends a very cheering graph about human prosperity since 1800, and you go, okay, good. We're still going to be okay. But the thing is, I think all those graphs flatten out in earnest by 2009, 2010. But basically in the 21st century, and those include the number of countries that are rated free or mostly free. It's kind of flattened out. World press freedoms. Freedom in America, I think, has, especially in terms of our relationship with the government, is worse. I think objectively worse, and that's a big problem. A lot of the reasons that you rightly talk about. But I think in your question is also the contradiction to that, which is that you have a YouTube channel with 55 million views, right? So the amount of freedom that we create, and it's the central paradox, I think, of our times, is that we are more free, and we're a little bit less free too. Where the prosperity and our own ingenuity and technology is liberating us like crazy. We have discovered, just think about all the workarounds we've created to public education in the last 20 years. My God, it's amazing. It's science fiction stuff. The number of, I think it's in the millions now, people who have just liberated themselves from K through 12 education the way it's done. That's remarkable. And yet, that education system, I don't know if it's worse, but it's certainly more carceral. There's more zero tolerance. There's a lot of stuff that's really wrong with it. And politically speaking, there's no longer any appetite at all on the Democratic Party for even flirting with tinkering with it. It's just like, we got to throw more money at this thing. And so there's, I think I'm really, really worried about the fact that at this point, both major political parties, or Nick Sarwark always tells me to call them the old parties. The old parties, and I take his orders in case that wasn't clear. There's no longer anyone even pretending that they care about a $20 trillion debt. Like that. Did you know that just didn't get any real press attention, but last week, the GOP-run Washington, Capitol Hill president, they just jacked up spending by a lot in the spending bill. Didn't we used to, I don't know, shut down the government over stuff like this? And it's not even talked about. I wrote a piece for Reason last year called Debt Denialists. And it's really striking. If you look at every single State of the Union address from 1997 to 2013, every single one mentioned we have to do something about our long-term entitlement problem. The baby boomers are going to retire. This is totally unfunded. It is a train wreck. The CBO comes out with death porn every 6 weeks about this stuff. We've never been here before. We're going to die. And they stopped caring about it. There are no more Democrats who agonize about this, and then whenever Republicans get power, they just, fiscal conservatism? No, I'm sorry, pickle conservatism. If we're going to misuse the word normalize, I would say Trump normalizing that level of fiscal irresponsibility is disastrous, and also teaching Republicans that they can just bullshit about this stuff and be successful. So I'm very worried about that, and that's going to create conditions that we might have even more sharp, sudden backsliding. So I'm normally very optimistic, and I believe that the free zone that we create for ourselves will ultimately either overwhelm or put at bay this thing that is trying to make us less free.
Right.
And that there will be sudden explosions that we can't control. Just because I was fortunate maybe enough to live through some of those sudden explosions, which no one had a hand in. I mean, I saw George H.W. Bush speak on the 1-year anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in Prague, in Wenceslas Square, November 17, 1990. And it was amazing. You go back and look at the speech. He sketches out a worldview of, he, like Thatcher, like probably Helmut Kohl, everyone, they were terrified because nobody was in charge of what was happening in the world. Like, it had gone off the rails. They didn't want Germany to unify so fast, but the world Germans said, screw it, we do. And there wasn't any, like, the last thing in the world they wanted was Czechoslovakia to break up. They didn't know why. They just knew that it'd be bad. They didn't want Yugoslavia to break up. And I knew in my stupid 22-year-old head, but I visited Yugoslavia already quite a bit, like, it's already broken up. The war has started, you realize here. These people can't stand each other, and they've got like 600-year-old grievances that they're going to have to work out somewhere. So, like, this sense of we've lost control over it can terrify elites, and so it's very thrilling to live through that. And I'm confident that we will have a sense of living through minor versions of that here as a way to ameliorate your correctly flagged loss of freedoms, which is a thing that's happening too.
True.
Thanks, Matt. We gotta go back to work.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Free market university basically started there.
Yeah, no,